I enjoy scaring people a lot. I enjoy suspense and action and thrills. And I enjoy comedy, I guess mainly the genres of films. I'm big on form and structure, and within a certain context doing certain things. The film I'm making now, Halloween, hopefully will be is a horror film, loaded with scares.
1980s horror films were defined by the slasher. You know their names: Freddy, Michael, Jason, Leatherface, Chucky. And there are two men who are highly responsible for that trend: Wes Craven and John Carpenter. John Carpenter ended the 1970s with Halloween, clearly defining what these films would look and feel like for the next decade plus.
Death has come to your little town, Sheriff. You can either ignore it or you can help me to stop it.
From that film, Michael Myers took off, becoming a horror icon, with 3 more direct sequels in the 80s, inspiring 12 sequels and remakes in all, the latest being Halloween Ends in 2022. Clearly, Michael Myers is still very much in the zeitgeist. Now, Carpenter himself wasn't involved as a director in any of the sequels, but he wrote Part 2 and produced and scored many of the others, and will forever be credited as Myers' creator. In 1984, Wes Craven changed the genre again, introducing us to Freddy Krueger in A Nightmare on Elm Street, again kickstarting a massive new franchise with 8 sequels starring the original Freddy, Robert Englund, and 1 remake with Jackie Earle Haley taking on the role of the dream-stalking psycho. Craven, like Carpenter, didn't direct most of the sequels, but came back and wrote and directed the 7th entry in A New Nightmare,
Miss me?
bringing Freddy into the real world and introducing us to meta-horror 2 years before he'd explode that idea with Scream in 1996, with 5 sequels of its own so far. Today, we're going to look back at each of their careers, compare and contrast these masters of horror, and talk about their influence on the genre. And at the end, I'll declare a victor in Craven versus Carpenter.
Fun game, Sydney. See, we ask you a question, and if you get it wrong, you die.
Wes Craven got his start in the late 60s, early 70s, initially working as a humanities professor with an interest in filmmaking. He got his first paid film gig as a sound editor at a small New York City film production company. During this time, he worked with and created a friendship with Sean S. Cunningham. Later, Sean would become best known for directing the original Friday the 13th. Together, they raised the money for Craven's first feature film, The Last House on the Left, with Cunningham producing and Craven writing and directing. The film was made on a shoestring budget, but became infamous for its trailer tagline,
"It's only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie."
and its brutality. Craven felt the backlash of its so-called celebration of the abuse of young women. After that film, Craven wanted to move away from horror, so he and Cunningham wrote a few non-horror scripts and tried to shop them around without any success. Craven noted at this time, "It was clear I wasn't going to do anything else unless it was scary." A friend suggested they make a movie in the deserts of Nevada, which had just been opened up to filmmakers. So Craven wrote the script for The Hills Have Eyes, and the two were able to raise the money to make the movie. The Hills Have Eyes follows a family on a vacation into the desert, where they meet up with a nasty group of irradiated cannibals. This and Last House were modest horror hits at the time, but have gone on to spawn sequels and remakes, crowning themselves as staples of the genre.
We're lost. The old creep told you not to get off the road.
Meanwhile, John Carpenter had been making short 8mm films for most of his adolescence, and wanted to study filmmaking at college, ultimately ending up at USC in 1968. While there, he wrote a film called The Resurrection of Bronco Billy, which won the Academy Award for Best Live-Action Short in 1970.
And for the filmmakers, we're all very grateful. Jim Rokos, Nick Castle, and John Carpenter.
Carpenter's first major feature film started as a student film, but grew beyond that, becoming 1974's Dark Star, a sci-fi comedy co-written with Dan O'Bannon, who later went on to write Alien. Are you seeing a trend here? Between the two of them, they wrote, directed, edited, scored, and created many of the film's special effects. Bannon also stars in the film, with Carpenter lending his voice to a character. It was considered a major filmmaking achievement for only $60,000, firmly planting both as up-and-comers in the independent film scene. Bannon went on to work on the special effects for a little film called Star Wars, and Carpenter moved on to write, direct, score, and edit the 1976 action thriller Assault on Precinct 13. This is where Carpenter first worked with writer-producer Deborah Hill, who became a major collaborator of his over the next decade. After viewing Assault on Precinct 13 at the Milan Film Festival, independent film producer Irwin Yablans and financier Mustafa Akkad sought out Carpenter to direct a film for them about a psychotic killer that stalked babysitters. Carpenter agreed to direct if he had full creative control. He and Deborah Hill wrote the script, originally called The Babysitter Murders, but set it on Halloween. In creating the story, Carpenter drew on the haunted house folklore that exists in many small towns, where there always seems to be the house that somebody was killed in or went crazy in. Made for only $300,000, it was shot in May of 1978, with a then unknown cast outside of veteran character actor Donald Pleasance. Carpenter chose to use the somewhat new Panaglide to film much of the movie, giving it a very unique floating look. Carpenter himself scored the film, creating its memorable theme on the piano in about an hour. Carpenter claims he can play any keyboard, but can't read or write music. The film went on to premiere just before Halloween 1978, and ended up grossing nearly $70 million worldwide, making it one of the most successful independent films of all time.
I wanted the audience not to know whether he was human or supernatural. And he had no character. He was blank. He was simply evil.
Moving into the 80s, Craven was continuing his horror run, writing and directing Deadly Blessing, Swamp Thing, and The Hills Have Eyes 2. All pretty forgettable films, none of them making a splash at the box office. But he was about to hit on something huge, A Nightmare on Elm Street. The film was inspired by a real-life story of Hmong refugees who, after fleeing their home countries because of war and genocide, didn't want to sleep because they suffered from such horrible nightmares. Some of these men even died in their sleep. Craven was struck by the idea of a nightmare being so horrible it could kill you. He gave that nightmare a face in Freddy Krueger.
A Nightmare on Elm Street was an idea that I had basically just based on the idea of somebody kind of being able to touch you in your dreams. And I had this kind of an image of this person just kind of leaning out of the ether of the air and touching the sleeper. That was it, you know.
He didn't want his villain to wear a mask like Michael or Jason, so instead he scarred his face with burns. And again he wanted an original murder weapon, not a kitchen knife, so came up with the idea of a glove with knife fingers. Craven pitched the script around, with most of the studios passing on the idea, until he brought it to the fledgling New Line Cinema, who agreed to produce it. Craven originally wanted a large actor to play the role, talking with Kane Hodder, who would take up the mantle of Jason Voorhees just a few years later. But his casting director had the idea of somebody small and weasel-like, suggesting Robert Englund. Englund went on to fully embody the role, creating a charismatic superstar out of a child serial killer.
This is God.
The film has beautiful, dreamy cinematography, many memorable death scenes. It introduced the world to Johnny Depp and made the idea of just falling asleep scary. The film became a good-sized hit, grossing $57 million worldwide. Freddy would go on to dominate the box office for the next decade, and New Line Cinema became known as the studio that Freddy built.
Welcome to prime time, bitch!
We're really getting into the meat of these two directors' careers. After Halloween, John Carpenter became the go-to director for genre pictures. In 1980, he co-wrote and directed The Fog, again starring Jamie Lee Curtis, who was quickly cementing her title of Scream Queen. In 1981, he introduced the world to Snake Plissken in the kick-ass action sci-fi flick Escape from New York, starring Kurt Russell as the one-eyed maniac tasked with saving the president from Manhattan, which has been turned into a giant prison for the world's worst criminals.
Looking for somebody.
Who?
The president.
He really here?
In 1982, he directed the quasi-remake of The Thing from Another World. The film bombed hard at the time, but many consider it to be Carpenter's best film. It's a masterpiece of claustrophobia and paranoia, with incredible performances and some of cinema's greatest monster makeup effects created by a young Rob Bottin.
I don't think you'll ever see effects like this in a movie. I know there hasn't been a monster movie like this, where the monster constantly changes form. It never looks like any one thing. It's constantly in motion. And it's pretty hard to pull off, but I think we've done all right.
He got a chance to direct an early Stephen King story with 1983's Christine. It's not easy to make a haunted car scary, but Carpenter pulls it off in spades. He changes directions quite a bit with 1984's Starman, a touching sci-fi drama about an alien who takes on the form of a widow's husband, comedically and sensitively portrayed by Jeff Bridges. Carpenter closes out the 80s with 3 more genre masterpieces. The comedy kung fu fantasy mashup Big Trouble in Little China, with the fast-talking Kurt Russell once again in the lead. He wrote and directed his terrifying take on the church and the devil with The Prince of Darkness, and finished it up with the oddly prescient They Live, about a man uncovering a conspiracy of aliens overtaking mankind by hiding in plain sight. It was Carpenter's twist on what he felt was happening in Reagan's America.
I think They Live was great for its time. I'm really proud of the film. I'm really proud of what it said, but it has to stand as a story also, not just as a polemic, a political diatribe, a rage.
Besides Nightmare, Craven's 80s were far less productive. He directed a very forgettable 1985 TV movie Chiller. 1986's Deadly Friend is an oddity about a dead teenage girl getting a microchip implanted in her brain, basically transforming her into a killer zombie robot. The film is most memorable for Anne Ramsey getting her head smashed in with a basketball. His second best film of the 80s was 1988's The Serpent and the Rainbow, which has Bill Pullman visiting Haiti on an exploration for a black magic drug which turns people into zombies, before having the drug used on him. It's a pretty strange trip and a great horror film. He closed out the 80s with Shocker, which feels like an unsuccessful shot at another horror icon, Horace Pinker, a serial killer who comes back from the dead, granted electricity powers from his death by electric chair. Craven's 1990s were far more successful, kicking it off with the well-made horror flick The People Under the Stairs, about a kid who accidentally gets trapped in a house with, well, some creepy people under the stairs. He returned to Freddy Krueger nearly a decade after creating him, with 1994's New Nightmare, casting himself, Robert Englund, and Heather Langenkamp to portray themselves in this play-up of Hollywood and horror sequels.
How long has Wes been working on this script?
With Freddy making his way into the real world. It's one of the better sequels and definitely the biggest departure the series took from itself along the way. In 1995, he made a strange misstep with the horror comedy Vampire in Brooklyn. Eddie Murphy plays the titular vampire. It's a minor detour on the way to Craven's next major horror series. Scream was written by Kevin Williamson, a struggling screenwriter who hit upon the idea to satirize 80s slasher films. The film was originally developed under the title Scary Movie, before landing on the final title of Scream. Craven at the time was again trying to move away from horror, but after the disappointment of Vampire in Brooklyn, he decided to take on the gig, seeing the script as a creative parody of the genre, as the characters were all very aware of horror movies and the cliches within.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1. You can never have sex.
The film went on to monster success, redefining what horror meant in the 90s. Many copycat films followed over the next decade. And Craven directed 3 more sequels in 1997, 2000, and 2011, with 2 more following recently in 2022 and 2023. Scream basically wrapped up Craven's career. He made 3 more horror-inspired features in the 2000s, with the poorly received teen werewolf flick Cursed in 2005, and the well-made taut airplane set thriller Red Eye, also in 2005. And 2010's My Soul to Take is a pretty forgettable supernatural serial killer film. His last film was Scream 4 in 2011, before his death in 2015 at age 76. No doubt leaving behind an incredible legacy of horror films, having a heavy hand in creating 2 of the most successful horror franchises ever.
We all have particular talents, we all have particular strengths and weaknesses. I certainly have a deep appreciation for other guys who are doing the same thing I do, and women, because it's hard, and it's not rewarded the way, standard films are.
Going back to the 1990s for John Carpenter, he really underperformed in contrast to Craven's renaissance. 1992's Memoirs of an Invisible Man is a strange bird of a film. It's a weird mashup of Carpenter's aesthetic mixed with Chevy Chase's humor. The film is interesting, but doesn't really work. Carpenter's last truly great film is 1994's In the Mouth of Madness. It's the last installment of what Carpenter calls his Apocalypse trilogy, preceded by The Thing and The Prince of Darkness. In this film, Sam Neill is an insurance investigator who visits a town in search of a popular horror author. The town has seemingly been overtaken by the creations of said writer, creating a wonderful sense of dread throughout and is honestly scary. He directs a toothless remake of Village of the Damned, a silly sequel in Escape from LA. 1998's Vampires is a bit of Carpenter-ish fun, but doesn't nearly hit the highs of many of his other films. By 2001's Ghost of Mars, and definitely by his last feature film, 2010's The Ward, Carpenter's juice seems to have been squeezed dry. But he continues to create to this day. He's still scoring films with that unique Carpenter synth sound, like the most recent Halloween trilogy and the 2022 Firestarter remake. He has also released 3 albums of original music and tours the world playing live music with his son Cody.
My answer to why I wanted to be a filmmaker, I had no choice. I fell in love. Fell in love with movies, with cinema. And things exist in cinema that don't exist in other places, in real life. I don't believe in the supernatural in real life, but it lives in cinema. It inhabits movie houses.
So that's a quick overview at the impressive careers of Craven and Carpenter. Let's get to the versus side of the video. We'll look at each of their careers in a couple of categories and crown a winner at the end. Creatively, just by numbers, Carpenter directed 21 feature-length films, including TV movies. He's credited with writing 16 feature scripts, 10 of which he directed. He scored 15 of his own films along with 5 others. Craven directed 24 feature-length films, also including TV movies, writing 9 of them himself. The amount of films they're credited on for producer and character creator are too numerous for me to count, so we'll call that part a draw. But I'll give Carpenter a slight nod simply because he scored so many of his own films, giving them that Carpenter feel from top to bottom. Looking at their careers by decade, I'll give the 1970s to Carpenter, simply for Halloween. But he also directed Dark Star and Assault on Precinct 13, both pretty great films on their own. While Craven created 2 memorable horror films in Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes, neither had nearly the impact of Halloween. I'll also score the 1980s for Carpenter because of his run of The Fog, Escape from New York, The Thing, Christine, Starman, Big Trouble in Little China, Prince of Darkness, and They Live is simply incredible. Not a stinker in the bunch, with a couple of masterpieces mixed in. Craven hit hard with A Nightmare on Elm Street and The Serpent and the Rainbow, but it's not quite enough to overcome that lineup. That's a 3-0 lead for Carpenter, but I'll score 1 for Craven for the 90s. He crafted a slasher masterpiece and redefined the horror genre with Scream, and followed it up with a strong sequel and the underappreciated Music of the Heart, a heartwarming Meryl Streep drama. He finally got the chance to make his non-horror film with this one, while Carpenter really only had one good film, Within the Mouth of Madness, and a handful of forgettable ones. I'll also give Craven the 2000s and beyond. He had 2 more Scream sequels and the nicely made thriller Red Eye, while none of Carpenter's directing work after 2000 is really worth viewing. So Craven is making a comeback, down 2-3. Now onto box office. This is where it gets a little tricky. Do we only count films they directed, or are we counting everything they've ever had a hand in? That's a lot of bloody box office to count between all the Halloween, Nightmare, and Scream sequels and remakes. So I'll just stick with films they directed. Craven wins this one pretty handedly. With 20 theatrical features, his films racked up almost $900 million at the box office, with the original Scream being the biggest hit of his career at $173 million worldwide. Carpenter comes in a pretty far second, with his films only making a little over $300 million. The biggest hit of his career being Halloween, making $70 million. So we're all tied up at 3-3. Critically, I'll average out all the scores of all their theatrical films based on Rotten Tomatoes scores and see who comes out the winner. Carpenter has 18 films listed on Rotten Tomatoes. His lowest rated is Ghost of Mars at 24%, and his highest rated is Halloween at 96%. All 18 films average out to 66% favorable. Craven has 20 films listed on Tomatoes, with The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 at an incredibly bad 0%, and The Nightmare on Elm Street at 95%, with his 20 films averaging out to 48%. Craven has a couple of major stinkers in there, which end up dragging him down. Carpenter is back on top, 4-3. Let's go to awards. Being mostly horror filmmakers, neither has been personally nominated for an Oscar or a Golden Globe. So instead, let's go to the Saturn Awards, which are presented annually by the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror Films, and have been giving out Golden Scrolls since 1973. They're basically the Oscars for genre films. Craven won a Life Career Award in 1995, right before he was nominated for Best Director in 1997 for Scream. He lost that year to John Woo for Face Off. Carpenter also won a Lifetime Achievement in 1996. He was nominated for Best Music in 1987, 88, and 99, winning for Best Special Effects in 1976 for Dark Star, and nominated for Best Director in 1982 for Escape from New York, losing to Spielberg for Raiders of the Lost Ark. So they both won Lifetime Awards and been nominated for Director. But I'll give the win to Carpenter again for his musical scores. And also remember, one of Carpenter's first films, The Resurrection of Bronco Billy, did win an Oscar for Best Short. He's now up 5-3 with only one category to go, making him the de facto winner. But the last category is a very big but also very subjective one, cultural impact. Carpenter, in my opinion, and according to his critical score, is the better filmmaker. His films look better, he's a master of widescreen cinematography. The acting is generally stronger in his films, and on average, he seemed to work with better scripts. He had a stronger career outside the horror genre, creating some very memorable action films with Escape from New York and Big Trouble in Little China. And Starman is a beautifully crafted drama. I don't think Craven ever made a film that could touch the outright brilliance of The Thing. So if it was purely up to me, I think Carpenter would win. But Craven was so much more in touch with general audiences. That's evident by his massive lead in the box office category. He created 4 films that went on to have sequels and or remakes. The Last House on the Left had 1 remake. The Hills Have Eyes had 1 direct sequel and 2 remake/sequels. And of course, A Nightmare on Elm Street had 9 sequels or remakes. And Scream with 5 sequels so far, and probably at least a couple more on the way. Carpenter's Halloween has the most sequels and remakes of any horror franchise with 12, and most likely more to come. The Thing, The Fog, and Assault on Precinct 13 were all reimagined to disappointing box office results, and Escape from New York inspired a sequel, which bombed horribly. So they've each had their fair share of sequels and remakes. But why am I using these to argue cultural impact? I think it's a good barometer for how a film has stuck in our culture. Do we want to revisit those characters? Do people want to see that story told again in a new way? So I think Craven has been a bit more successful in creating stories that people want to revisit. While I prefer the films of Carpenter, I'll give the cultural impact win to Craven, mainly for his creation of Freddy Krueger and his violent birthing of Ghostface, both who live on decades after their introduction. So John Carpenter wins the overall competition. But there's no doubt that both filmmakers and many other films will live on in infamy. And all us horror fans are the real winners for getting to watch their beautifully crafted scary films and the hundreds of other films and filmmakers inspired by their work. A huge thank you to both of them.
That's just respecting the material and respecting the genre and saying it doesn't have to be banal, it doesn't have to be exploitive, it doesn't have to be shallow. Anything you're capable of putting into this genre, it will take it. And there will be a smart audience that will see it.
Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.